On the night of August 18th, 2026, with less than 6 hours left on the clock, Donald Trump picked up the phone, called Ottawa, and paused a 50% tariff that was about to hit $20 billion of Canadian goods. That call, and what happened in the days around it, is the story we're going to walk through today. Because it did not start last week. It started more than a year and a half earlier, in the cold first days of a trade war that nobody in Ottawa asked for, and it has been building, deal by broken deal, threat by threat, ever since. To understand why a midnight phone call in August 2026 actually matters, you have to go back to February 1st, 2025. That's the day Donald Trump signed an executive order imposing near-universal tariffs on Canada and Mexico, citing concerns about fentanyl trafficking and border security. It was one of his first major trade actions of the new administration, and it landed on a country that, at the time, didn't even have a permanent prime minister in place. Justin Trudeau was still in a caretaker role. The Liberal Party was mid-leadership race. And Canada, a country where more than a fifth of the entire economy depends on trade with the United States, suddenly found itself staring down tariffs with no settled government to answer them. That vacuum didn't last long. By March 2025, Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and later the Bank of England, had won the Liberal leadership and was sworn in as Prime Minister. And almost immediately, Ottawa became the center of a very different kind of conversation with Washington. Carney's first public move as incoming Prime Minister was symbolic but pointed. He toured a steel plant in Hamilton, Ontario, on the very day Trump's administration raised tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports to 25%. And he told reporters he was ready to sit down with Trump, but only, in his words, under a position where there is respect for Canadian sovereignty. That phrase, respect for sovereignty, would become the spine of everything that followed. Because Trump, throughout this period, wasn't just talking tariffs. He was talking about Canada becoming the 51st state. He referred to the Canadian Prime Minister more than once as a governor. In an NBC interview in May 2025, he told host Kristen Welker he would always talk about Canadian statehood. For a lot of Canadians, that wasn't just an insult, it was the entire election. When Canadians went to the polls in April 2025, the vote was widely described, including by outlets like Global News, as a referendum on how the country should respond to Trump's annexation rhetoric. Carney's Liberals won a minority government, and the phrase elbows up, a hockey term for playing physical and defending yourself, became the shorthand for his entire approach to Washington. So when Carney finally sat down across from Trump in the Oval Office in May 2025 for his first visit as Prime Minister, the stakes went well beyond trade numbers. According to reporting from Al Jazeera, Carney used the moment to draw a very specific line. He told Trump, "As you know from real estate, there are some places that are never for sale." It was a quiet, controlled sentence delivered in a room where Trump had spent the previous months publicly musing about absorbing Canada's economy into America's. Ottawa was watching that meeting closely, because for a government that had just won an election on standing up to Trump, the optics of that first face-to-face mattered almost as much as any tariff schedule. But optics don't pay tariffs, and the numbers kept climbing. In March 2025, after the steel and aluminum tariffs hit 25%, Canada retaliated with roughly 29.8 billion Canadian dollars in counter tariffs on American goods, according to Euronews reporting at the time. That set the pattern for the next year. Washington escalates, Ottawa counterpunches, and then both sides circle back to the table to talk about de-escalating what they'd just escalated. It happened again in June 2025 when Trump doubled aluminum tariffs to 50%. It happened in July when Trump sent Carney a letter, posted publicly on Truth Social, threatening a 35% tariff on all Canadian goods starting August 1st, unless a deal was reached by July 21st. That letter included a line that tells you a lot about how Trump frames these negotiations. There will be no tariff if Canada or companies within your country decide to manufacture product within the United States. It's worth understanding why the steel and aluminum sector became the flashpoint it did, because it's not an arbitrary choice on Trump's part. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of both steel and aluminum to the United States, according to reporting at the time from Euronews and other outlets. That means any tariff aimed at those two metals hits Canadian producers harder in raw volume than it hits almost any other exporting country in the world. Ontario alone accounts for a huge share of that steel output, and towns built around plants like the one Carney visited in Hamilton have spent much of the past year and a half absorbing the shock of shifting American demand. It's also why Ontario Premier Doug Ford became such a visible figure in this saga, well before any federal deal was finalized. According to CBC News, sources close to the file said the Canadian side aggressively argued to American negotiators that there would be no political appetite among Canadians to keep talks going at all if the August 19th tariffs actually took effect. That's a striking detail because it suggests Ottawa was, at least in private, prepared to consider walking away from the table entirely rather than simply absorbing another round of escalation. Softwood lumber is another piece of this puzzle that rarely gets the same headlines as steel or autos, but has quietly simmered for decades, long before Trump's second term began. Canada and the United States have disputed lumber tariffs on and off since the 1980s, and that older, mostly forgotten dispute has occasionally resurfaced inside the broader 2025 and 2026 tariff conversations, as one more example of how tangled these two economies already were before Trump's fentanyl-related order in February 2025. It's part of why negotiators on both sides have repeatedly said this isn't a single negotiation so much as a bundle of overlapping disputes: steel, aluminum, autos, dairy, lumber, and now wildfire smoke, that all have to be threaded through the same set of conversations in Washington and Ottawa at once. Canada didn't hit that July 21st deadline. Neither side did. And this is where it's worth pausing, because it would be easy to tell this story as a straight line toward resolution, and that's not what the record shows. Carney himself set a target of reaching a deal by the end of July 2025. That deadline passed. He then reportedly aimed for July 31st, 2026, as a revised target. That one passed too. Critics, including voices aligned with conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, have pointed to those missed deadlines repeatedly, arguing that Carney oversold his ability to manage Trump directly. Whatever side of that argument you land on, the fact of the missed deadlines itself is not in dispute, and it matters for how we read what's happening right now in Ottawa. Because what's happening right now is the closest thing to a breakthrough this relationship has produced in 18 months, and it came right after one of the ugliest weeks of the entire saga. In early August 2026, Trump gave a speech in Las Vegas in which he said, quote, "Canada's nasty, they are. They're nasty. I love the people, but they're nasty. Nasty leadership." Carney's response, delivered in French to reporters in Toronto and reported by the Associated Press through both ABC News and PBS, was almost as blunt. "This is a tough negotiation," Carney said. "You can say nasty. But this is a question of Canadian jobs. It's a question of the future of Canadian businesses." He added that Canada was, in his words, in the middle of a tariff war with the Americans, and, according to PBS, actually laughed when a reporter asked him about Trump's choice of the word nasty. That same week, Carney made a point of putting a number on the pain. He said U.S tariffs on aluminum had already pushed prices up 58% inside the United States itself, arguing that the tariffs weren't just squeezing Canadian exporters, they were squeezing American companies that rely on that metal. It's a detail worth sitting with because so much of the political framing around these tariffs on both sides of the border treats them as something one country does to the other. Carney's aluminum figure was a reminder that tariffs, structurally, tend to bite the country that imposes them almost as hard as the one they're aimed at. Around the same period, the legal side of this fight also produced one of the more consequential developments of the entire 18 months, even though it barely registered outside financial and legal reporting at the time. In February 2026, the U.S Supreme Court struck down the specific tariffs Trump had justified on the grounds of alleged drug trafficking, the fentanyl-related tariffs that had been part of his original February 2025 order. That ruling didn't end the broader tariff regime between the two countries, because Trump's administration simply shifted its legal justification and its tariff mechanism, eventually relying on Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 for the batch of duties that were set to hit on August 19, 2026. But it's an important data point because it shows that even inside the United States, the legal basis for some of these tariffs has been genuinely contested, not just politically, but constitutionally, and Canada's negotiators have been aware of that legal uncertainty the entire time they've sat across the table from American officials. There was also a second irritant simmering underneath the trade fight that rarely makes the headlines outside Canada: wildfire smoke. According to reporting from The Hill, the Trump administration said in early August 2026 that it would hold Canada accountable for smoke from Canadian wildfires drifting into more than a dozen American states. The Canadian Wildland Fire Information System was tracking hundreds of active fires at the time. It's a strange thing to see show up in the middle of a tariff negotiation, but it's a real example of how tangled these two economies and environments have become, and how almost any friction point can get pulled into the broader argument. Then came the deadline that actually forced movement. August 19th, 2026. New tariffs under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 were scheduled to take effect at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time that day, covering more than $28 billion in Canadian goods, according to CBC News. This wasn't a narrow industrial tariff aimed at steel mills or auto plants. It hit hundreds of everyday consumer products: plywood, cement, wine, even hockey sticks. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business, representing roughly 103,000 members, warned that the new duties could grind their U.S. sales to a halt, according to CNBC, and some businesses said American buyers were already pulling back on future orders in anticipation. Late on the night before that deadline, Trump paused the 50% tariffs. In a post on Truth Social, he said the pause was based on progress in the negotiations. Carney's own statement that night was notably more careful in tone than Trump's. Substantial progress has been made, Carney's office said, although there is important work still to be done. That kind of careful, almost clipped language from Ottawa has been a pattern throughout this entire relationship. Carney tends to underpromise publicly, even when, as we'll get to, he's willing to claim credit loudly once a deal firms up. By the next day, Wednesday, August 19th, the outlines of an actual framework began to leak out through multiple outlets. According to CBC News and CNBC, both citing sources close to the negotiations, the emerging deal would cut U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum from 50% down to 25%. It would also lower the headline tariff rate on Canadian-built cars and trucks from 25% to 15%. In exchange, Canada was reportedly prepared to ask its provinces to put American alcohol brands back on liquor store shelves, a retaliatory measure that had pulled U.S. booze out of stores across the country as one of Canada's earliest countermeasures back in 2025. Canada was also said to be considering lifting some of its broader retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods. It's also worth spending a moment on who's actually been sitting across the table in Washington, because these negotiations have not been a purely leader-to-leader affair, despite how much attention the Trump-Carney phone calls get. Dominic LeBlanc, Canada's minister responsible for Canada-U.S. trade, has been the day-to-day face of Ottawa's side of this file, traveling to Washington repeatedly through 2025 and 2026 for rounds of talks that Carney himself has described as intense and delicate. On the American side, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer has been a recurring name in CBC's reporting on these sessions, part of the broader team negotiating alongside Trump's own public statements and Truth Social posts. That distinction matters because it explains some of the mixed signals we've seen throughout this saga. Trump tends to announce outcomes in broad, confident strokes on social media, while officials like LeBlanc and Greer are the ones actually working through the technical, line-by-line language of tariff schedules and exemptions back in their respective capitals. According to CBC News, Carney and Trump spoke by phone on the Monday before the August 19th deadline, and again earlier on the Tuesday, before LeBlanc followed up with further conversations of his own. That layered structure, leader calls, followed by ministerial follow-through, has been the operating rhythm of this entire relationship since Carney took office. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, when CNBC asked him directly whether the steel and aluminum reduction was actually on the table, gave a careful non-answer. As negotiations are still ongoing and we are working collectively with the U.S. administration towards a finalized agreement, we will not provide further comments, he told the outlet in a text message. That's an important detail to flag honestly. As of this recording, the Canadian government has not officially confirmed the specific numbers being reported. What we have is source-based reporting from credible outlets, not an on-the-record government confirmation of every figure. Trump, for his part, was considerably louder about it. "We've come to a deal with Canada," he said, according to CNBC, describing a very good conversation with Carney. He also said Canadian tariffs would be non-existent for our farmers, though notably without specifying exactly which duties he meant. That line matters because dairy access has been one of the most persistent irritants in this entire relationship. Trump's original 50% tariff threat was partly justified by allegations that Canada was discriminating against American dairy producers under its supply management system, a system Canada has defended for decades as essential to protecting its own farmers. Carney's own public statement was, again, more measured than Trump's at first. His office said only that substantial progress has been made. But by midday Wednesday, in a post on social media platform X, Carney allowed himself a more confident tone. He said Canada had entered these discussions with the best overall trade terms, and that the country was now moving towards an agreement that reinforces that Canadian advantage, including by securing the best terms in each of Canada's most important strategic sectors, and providing greater certainty about our future trading relationship. It's a notably different register from the man who, weeks earlier, was laughing off the word nasty in French to reporters in Toronto. That shift from defensive caution to public claims of leverage is really the heart of why this moment is getting so much attention right now. Carney's answer to Trump's pressure didn't just avert a tariff deadline. It changed the tone of the entire negotiation, at least for this news cycle. It's worth being honest, though, about how contested that framing already is inside Canada. Global News reported that reaction in the comment sections and among opposition-aligned voices has been sharply split. Some Canadians are calling this an excellent deal. Others, including supporters of Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, are accusing Carney of bootlicking Trump and missing his own self-imposed deadline of July 31st, 2026 by nearly 3 weeks, arguing that 16 months after being elected, largely on a platform of standing up to the United States, Carney ultimately negotiated on terms set by Washington's timeline, not Ottawa's. Whether that criticism is fair or overstated is genuinely a matter of political opinion, not verified fact, and we want to be upfront that it remains a live and unresolved argument inside Canadian politics as of this recording. It's also worth remembering that this entire trade relationship isn't happening in isolation from the rest of Carney's foreign policy, because Trump's tariff pressure has pushed Ottawa to actively diversify who it trades with. Through 2025 and into 2026, Carney made repeated trips to Europe, seeking what outlets described as new economic alliances, partly as a hedge against exactly the kind of dependency on the American market that made Canada so vulnerable to Trump's tariff threats in the first place. In January 2026, Carney gave a speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos that was widely interpreted, according to CNBC, as an indirect rebuke of the kind of economic coercion Trump had been threatening against Canada. That's a strategic thread worth noting, because even as Ottawa negotiates directly with Washington on tariff percentages, it has been simultaneously trying to reduce how much leverage any single tariff dispute with the United States can have over the Canadian economy going forward. More than a fifth of Canada's entire economy depends on trade with the U.S., and a majority of Canada's population lives within roughly 100 miles of the American border, according to the figures cited by a White House official to CNBC, numbers that explain both why Trump's tariffs land as hard as they do and why Carney has been so motivated to find other markets, even while these negotiations continue. It's also worth noting the human and business costs that ran underneath this entire 18-month period, well before Wednesday's framework began to take shape. When Canada's counter-tariffs and the broader elbows-up consumer boycott of American products took hold in 2025, cross-border tourism and travel dropped noticeably, and provincial liquor boards across the country pulled American wine, beer, and spirits off their shelves entirely, a move that's only now, as part of this new framework, being partially reversed. Border businesses on both sides described the uncertainty itself as being almost as damaging as the tariffs, because companies couldn't plan production schedules or pricing months in advance when tariff rates seemed to shift every few weeks depending on the state of negotiations. That instability is part of why the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, representing over 100,000 members, was so vocal in the days before the August 19th deadline about the risk of yet another sudden disruption to supply chains that had already been rattled repeatedly since February 2025. Let's zoom out for a second, because the specific tariff percentages, while important, aren't the whole story. This entire 18-month saga has really been a test of something bigger, whether a mid-sized economy that sends the overwhelming majority of its exports to a single neighboring superpower can hold a firm negotiating line against that same superpower without either provoking economic self-harm or folding entirely. Carney came into office promising exactly that kind of firm line. He said something similar around the same period, warning that there's not a lot of evidence right now that the U.S. wants a deal without tariffs. A blunt acknowledgement that, in his own assessment, Washington might simply prefer a permanent tariff relationship over a genuinely tariff-free one. That assessment turned out to be largely accurate. Even with this new framework taking shape, nobody involved, not Trump, not Carney, not LeBlanc, is describing this as the end of tariffs between the two countries. What's being described is a reduction. Steel and aluminum from 50 to 25%, autos from 25 to 15%, not an elimination. Canada is still living inside a tariff relationship with the United States. It's just a somewhat less punishing one than it was on August 18th. There's another layer worth adding here, because it explains why this negotiation carries so much weight beyond the immediate dollar figures. Back in May 2025, Carney told CBC's Power and Politics that more progress needs to be made on resolving the tariff issue before renegotiation talks could even begin on CUSMA, the trade agreement that governs the broader Canada-U.S. Mexico trading relationship, and that's due for a scheduled review. In other words, everything happening right now, the steel percentages, the auto tariffs, the alcohol shelves, is really a prelude. It's the warm-up act before a much larger conversation about the entire structural trade relationship between these two countries, one that touches manufacturing supply chains, energy, agriculture, and the movement of goods across what Trump himself once suggested was practically a fictional line. That line, incidentally, is one of the more revealing things Trump has said throughout this whole period. According to CBC reporting from March 2025, Trump suggested the Canada-U.S. border was essentially artificial, a framing that fits neatly with his repeated 51st state comments and his description of Canada's prime minister as a governor. Carney's entire political project, from his swearing in through this week's tariff pause, has been a rebuttal to that framing. When Carney invited King Charles, Canada's head of state, to personally deliver the country's throne speech in May 2025, it wasn't just ceremonial. Carney told reporters it was a very clear message being sent to other countries around the world. It was a deliberate, symbolic underlining of Canadian sovereignty at a moment when American rhetoric was actively questioning it. So where does that leave us right now in Ottawa as negotiators finalize the legal text of this new framework? According to CBC News, Canadian and American negotiators were working through Wednesday, August 19, 2026, to complete that final text, with officials from both governments confirming talks were ongoing but declining to release full details. Nobody, at the time of this recording, has published the complete signed agreement. What we have is a paused 50% tariff, a set of reported reductions on steel, aluminum, and autos, a Canadian pledge to potentially restock American alcohol, and two leaders publicly describing substantial progress, even as they characterized that progress in very different tones. Trump, loud and declarative; Carney, careful and qualified, at least until his more confident social media post. It's also worth noting what this deal does not appear to touch based on current reporting. The dairy dispute, tied to Canada's supply management system, remains a background irritant, with Trump's comment about tariffs being non-existent for our farmers, left frustratingly vague on specifics. The broader CUSMA review, which could reshape far more of this relationship than any single tariff percentage, hasn't formally begun. And the underlying tension over sovereignty, the 51st state rhetoric, the governor comments, the nasty exchange, hasn't disappeared just because a tariff rate moved from 50 to 25% on paper. Trade wars built on rhetoric this personal don't usually end with a single framework agreement. They tend to cool, flare again, and cool once more in cycles, and there's nothing in the reporting so far to suggest this cycle is any different. What makes this moment genuinely significant, though, and worth understanding in this kind of detail, is the shift in Carney's public posture. For 18 months, his default mode in public was caution. Substantial progress, important work still to be done, language designed to avoid overpromising after the political cost of missing his own July 2025 and July 2026 deadlines. The pivot to declaring that Canada secured the best overall trade terms and the best terms in each of Canada's most important strategic sectors is a notably different kind of statement, one that invites scrutiny the moment the final legal text is actually published. If the numbers match what he's claiming, it strengthens his position heading into whatever comes next, including the eventual CUSMA review. If they don't fully match, and Trade Minister LeBlanc's careful refusal to confirm specifics suggests there's still room for that gap to appear, it hands ammunition directly to critics already accusing him of overselling the outcome. Before we close, let's be precise about what's confirmed and what isn't, because that distinction matters more in a story like this than almost any other detail. It is confirmed, through Trump's own Truth Social post and CBC and CNBC reporting, that the 50% tariffs scheduled for August 19, 2026 were paused. It is confirmed, through Carney's own public statement, that substantial progress has been made, though his office explicitly said work remains. It is reported, by CBC News and CNBC, sourced to people familiar with the negotiations, but not yet confirmed on the record by the Canadian government, that steel and aluminum tariffs would fall from 50 to 25%, and auto tariffs from 25 to 15%. It is reported similarly that Canada is considering restocking American alcohol and easing some retaliatory tariffs. It is not confirmed, and Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc explicitly declined to confirm it, exactly what the final signed text will say. And Trump's comment that tariffs would be non-existent for our farmers remains vague enough that it should be treated as a claim, not a settled fact, until Washington or Ottawa specifies which tariffs he actually meant. Our sources for everything in this script include CNBC's reporting from August 18th and 19th, 2026, on the tariff pause and the emerging framework. CBC News reporting from the same window on the paused Section 338 tariffs, the $28 billion scope of the affected goods, and the ongoing text negotiations. The Associated Press, carried through both ABC News and PBS, on Carney's nasty remarks and his aluminum price figures. The Hills, reporting on the wildfire smoke dispute and Carney's mid-2025 comments about intensifying negotiations. Al Jazeera's coverage of the May 2025 Oval Office meeting. Euronews reporting on Canada's initial $29.8 billion retaliatory tariff package. And CBC's ongoing coverage of Carney's sovereignty-focused statements dating back to March 2025. Where claims came from opposition politicians, social media reaction, or unnamed sources close to negotiations, rather than named officials or on-the-record statements, we've tried to flag that distinction clearly rather than presenting it as settled fact. There's one more angle worth adding before we close, because it helps explain why Canadian public opinion on all of this has been so split, and why Carney's political calculation here is genuinely difficult, not just a matter of finding the right talking points. Polling, cited by Global News through 2025 and 2026, consistently found that most Canadians supported some form of retaliation against U.S. tariffs, even when that retaliation carried real economic costs for Canadian consumers and businesses. That's an important piece of context, because it means Carney was never negotiating with a public that simply wanted the cheapest, fastest possible deal at any cost. A large share of his own electorate wanted to see Ottawa push back, hold firm, and avoid the appearance of caving, which is part of why the elbows-up framing worked politically in the first place, and part of why any deal that looks like a retreat carries real political risk for him now, regardless of what the actual tariff numbers end up being. At the same time, the economic pressure on ordinary Canadians from a prolonged trade war has been real and measurable, not just theoretical. Beyond the 58% aluminum price increase Carney cited, businesses on both sides of the border spent much of 2025 warning about rising costs for construction materials, automobiles, and household goods that rely on steel, aluminum, or cross-border manufacturing supply chains. The auto sector in particular has been repeatedly flagged as vulnerable because modern vehicle manufacturing in North America is deeply integrated across the Canada-U.S. border, with parts sometimes crossing back and forth multiple times before a finished vehicle rolls off the line. That's part of why the reported cut in auto tariffs from 25% down to 15% is being treated as such a significant piece of this emerging framework, even though it's still, notably, not a return to zero. It's also worth remembering how quickly the terms of this negotiation have shifted over time, because that volatility is itself part of the story. In March 2025, the headline tariff rate under discussion was 25% on steel and aluminum. By June 2025, aluminum tariffs had doubled to 50%. By July, Trump was threatening a blanket 35% tariff on all Canadian goods. By August 2026, the number on the table for the newest round of duties had climbed to 50% again, this time applied to a different, broader basket of consumer goods under Section 338, rather than the earlier national security tariff mechanisms. Tracking that sequence matters because it shows this hasn't been a single, steadily rising escalation. It's been a series of separate flashpoints, each with its own legal justification, its own percentage, and its own deadline, stacking on top of each other over 18 months. Understanding that pattern is part of what makes it possible to read this week's pause and framework agreement with appropriate caution, rather than assuming it represents a permanent resolution. If you've been following this relationship since Trump's first tariff order back in February 2025, you'll know this is far from the first breakthrough that's been announced, and it may not be the last twist either. Ottawa has been here before, at moments that looked like resolution and turned out to be pauses. What feels different this time is Carney's own language, the shift from defensive caution to a public claim of favorable terms, at a moment when the actual signed text still isn't public. Whether that confidence holds up once the details are finalized is genuinely an open question, and it's one worth watching closely in the days ahead, because the answer will shape not just this tariff dispute, but the tone heading into whatever comes next between these two countries. If stories like this, ones that actually slow down and separate what's confirmed from what's still being reported, are useful to you, it's worth subscribing so you don't miss the follow-up once the final text of this agreement actually becomes public. Because based on the pattern of this negotiation, there's a real chance the details shift again before they're locked in. This is also exactly the kind of story where staying subscribed pays off, because the CUSMA review that both governments keep referencing hasn't even started yet, and that's likely to be a much bigger negotiation than anything we've covered today. And if you want the kind of analysis that goes past the headlines and tracks these disputes as they evolve week to week, rather than just reacting to whichever side is louder that day, subscribing is the simplest way to make sure this channel's coverage actually reaches you when the next update lands. So here's the question worth sitting with. Mark Carney built his entire political identity on the idea that Canada would not bend to pressure from Washington. And this week, he's publicly claiming Canada secured the best possible terms available. Do you think that claim will hold up once the full agreement is public? Or do you think the missed deadlines and the pressure of that August 19th tariff cliff meant Ottawa ultimately negotiated on Washington's timeline rather than its own? Let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.